Fellas, the UFC is a very diverse company. I mean, recently we've been to Manchester, we've been to Abu Dhabi, we're about to go to Perth as well. And on a yearly basis, the UFC does tend to go to multiple different venues and countries. So I'm going to be doing a tier list of the different venues that the UFC usually go to. And I'm going to be including the ones they go to on like a yearly basis. I'm not going to include a venue that they went to like 5 years ago and then never went to again. I'm going to be talking about the regular ones. And when I say venue, I'm going to be categorizing most of them by country, so I'm not going to pick every single individual venue in Brazil or USA. I'm going to be talking about the main ones, and if it needs its separate ranking, I will do that. And when I say venue, I'm talking about like the crowd, the overall experience, how good the cards tend to be, so everything's going to be coming into account. And we'll start off with the UK. We've just had UFC Manchester. We usually go to Manchester or London on like a yearly basis, and now we tend to get more pay-per-views. So the UK, I'm going to put it in A tier. Now, the things that bring the UK down is, I mean, first of all, Dana White pretty much said that every pay-per-view that takes place in the UK is now going to be in American local time, which isn't, I mean, that's going to be, I'm not going to make excuses for the fighters, but it's not going to be beneficial for the fighters. And obviously the crowd, I mean, there was images of a bunch of fans sleeping at like 4 AM in the crowd, and it's obviously not going to be beneficial for the people buying tickets. So that's definitely going to have to bring it down. And another problem with the UK crowd, I mean, they have one of the best crowds in the UFC, don't get me wrong. They chant, they get behind their fighters, they do everything that you can need from a crowd. But I feel like whenever there's a fight that doesn't involve an English fighter, they kind of just die down and die out. And I feel like they have to sometimes rely on a finish, but on a general basis, definitely one of the best crowds in the UFC. I mean, at 4 AM, they were still cheering for Paddy Pimblett and Tom Aspinall, so the UK, or most of the European crowds in general, definitely one of the best, and I'm going to put it in A tier. Definitely one of the best crowds in the UFC, and I think you can't really complain when they go to the UK. In terms of how stacked the cards are, it's not overly stacked. It's definitely not one of the more stacked pay-per-views of the year, but it does just tend to be filled with fighters from the UK, which, you know, is to be expected. That's rightfully so. So, yeah, UK, definitely one of the best in the UFC, even though there's a few things that drag it down. And then we've got USA, and I've used Madison Square Garden to represent it. Now, again, I'm not going to be going through every single venue in the USA. I'm going to be categorizing it just by, you know, the main ones, and if there is a venue that needs its own separate ranking, I will do that. But for the USA, I'm going to put them in B tier. It's kind of hard because there's so many different venues, and pretty much every single event, or most events, tend to be in the USA. But they're a really good crowd. Well, not a really good crowd. They're a good crowd. They cheer when you need to cheer. They boo when you need to boo. They cheer on the fan favorites. They boo the people who everyone hates. They don't really get behind their countries. They don't really sing along with walkouts. They don't really start chants unless it's like a Donald Trump chant when he walks in the building. But yeah, they're a good crowd at USA, very reliable, which is why they have some of the most stacked cards there. I mean, they've had UFC 300 there, UFC 299. All the main stacked cards tend to be in the USA, and that's just because it's reliable. So yeah, I'll put USA in B tier. There's nothing overly amazing with them. They don't really have one of the best crowds. They just have a good crowd. There's nothing really bad I can say about it, but there's nothing overly special. It's kind of like the default is the USA, so I think B tier definitely suits it the most. And then we've got, here we have Salt Lake City, and I don't know why the UFC keep returning to Salt Lake City. I'm going to put it in D tier. Out of all the places they go to in the USA, I don't know why they keep going to Salt Lake City on a yearly basis. It's obviously not the best to watch. I think they're going again for UFC 307, and I just don't know why they do it. The fighters' performance always lacks there. I mean, if you look at the past couple of pay-per-views we've had there, UFC 291, when we went to Salt Lake City, Jan Blachowicz was gassed after the first round. Obviously, that fight went to a decision, the only decision of Alex Pereira's light heavyweight career. The year before that, Paulo Costa and Luke Rockhold, it was a fun fight, but it was a slugfest. Leon Edwards looked completely off when he was fighting Usman in that rematch. I just feel like Salt Lake City, I just don't understand it. If you could go to any place in the USA, why are you going to the place so high above sea level to the point where the fighter's performance is highly affected? It obviously affects the fighter's performance. Everybody gets gassed out way too quickly. There's a lot more slugfests on the card, and I feel like fighters are quite tentative to engage in a scrap because of the fear of getting gassed out. So Salt Lake City, I'm going to put it in D tier. When it's a venue that's that bad that it, you know, tends to, you know, take away from the fighter's performance, it can't get anything above a D tier. Salt Lake City, don't know why the UFC always go there. It's getting a D tier. Then we've got Australia, or New Zealand, whatever. I'm going to put the Australian crowd in S tier. Now, the UFC don't go to Australia too often. It seems like now they go once a year for a pay-per-view. But I'm going to say they probably have some of the best in the UFC. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's the first fight of the night or the last fight. The Australians, I mean, first of all, the fights that take place in Australia seem to be some of the best. UFC 284, Makhachev versus Volkanovski, Yair Rodriguez finishing Josh Emmett. And I can guarantee UFC 305 is going to be a banger as well. So the cards in Australia tend to be really really good. Usually headlined by like Volkanovski or Israel Adesanya, but they tend to be a really good crowd in Australia. The chants, UFC 284, the chants that were going on there, some of the loudest crowds in UFC history, and the fact that I'm pretty sure it is in Australian local time for most of the time as well. I think they're the best crowd in the UFC, and I think they have definitely one of the best venues in the UFC. Even if it's a shit card, at least it took place in Australia in front of a good crowd, and usually they never are really shit cards anyway. I mean, yeah, Australia, I'm going to put it in S tier, one of the best venues in the UFC, and every single time they go there, you know, it just exceeds the expectation. Then we have Brazil. Yeah, Brazil are also going to have to go in D tier for this one. I think they have the worst. I mean, they're just bad at everything, aren't they? The crowd are horrible. I mean, they're good at cheering on their own fighters, but then whenever a fighter loses, they leave. I mean, in the main event, when Pantoja won, everyone was gone by the time of the Octagon interview. When Glover Teixeira retired, the entire crowd were gone. They're just I don't know, they're just a bad crowd as well. When Moreno beat Figueiredo, they were throwing things at him and trying to attack him as well. It's just they're just not a crowd that you want in the UFC, and the cards never really tend to be stacked in Brazil as well. And I mean, UFC 301 was not stacked on paper. I'm not saying it was a bad card. It definitely performed well, but on paper it wasn't great. UFC, I think it was 282 or 283 the last time they went to Brazil. Before that wasn't great. The fight nights always tend to be cursed as well. Gelton Almeida versus Derek Lewis was terrible. Brazil just aren't really that good, and I don't know if they have a deal, but I don't know why they go there on a yearly basis. I know they have a massive market for Brazilian fighters, and the fighters aren't the problem. They've got some really good fighters, but the crowd are just, they leave every single time the main event loses or whatever, or even if the main event winning Pantoja's case, they're out the arena already. The chants are just, you know, boring as well. It's the same chant over and over again, throwing things at the enemy. One of the most vicious crowds in the UFC, and I just feel like something bad happens at every card, whether it be, like I said, the fans were, you know, going away after the retirement of Glover Teixeira, or Pantoja's Octagon interview, or, you know, whenever they just have shit cards over there, or a boring main event. Brazil are definitely some of the worst in the UFC, so I'm going to put Brazil in D tier. It's never really a good experience when watching a UFC event in Brazil, which is a shame as well, because they've got such a stacked market for the fighters. I mean, you go in every UFC rankings, there's at least like 5 fighters that tend to be from Brazil, so I'm going to put Brazil in D tier. It's never a good experience when we go to Brazil, and if we can keep the Brazilian attendance to a minimum, that would be great. Then we've got France. I'm going to put France in S tier with Australia. Now, France, they might be struggling in terms of fighters. I mean, their best fighter is Cyril Gane, and he fights once a year, and he's got a 50% chance of winning, 50% chance of losing, but France are really good. At UFC Paris last year, it was like, I think it was like the early prelims when a French fighter was fighting. The crowd was wild. They have some of the best crowds in the UFC. They go absolutely wild, and I feel like it's just because they don't really have events that often in France. Maybe one fight night a year, and they definitely make the most of it. Some of the loudest crowds, some of the loudest pop. They're usually in by the early prelims as well, all up until the main event. When Cyril Gane won last year in Paris against Sergey Spivak, and when he won against Tatu Ivazi, they were loud. They get behind their fighters. They have chants. They're loud by the early prelims, and I think it might be in local time as well for France, because I remember last time I watched a French card when it was Gane versus Spivak, it was in local time, so they just have everything going for them, and there's nothing bad I can say about France. I just feel bad for them that they don't have any really good fighters. I mean, they've got Cyril Gane, who, like I said, fights once a year. Ben Saint-Denis, who just got Frochek. So if the French had more fighters, I would not be mad at having a pay-per-view in France, because they are some of the best crowds in the UFC, and there's obviously nothing bad I can say about the French when it comes to a venue. So UFC in Paris and France, I'm going to put that straight into S tier. And then we've got the Apex. The Apex is going in C tier. Now, at the beginning, when the Apex first got introduced, it wasn't that bad. Like, I kind of liked the whole idea of having no crowd. You could hear the shots better. You could hear the coaching advice more. It just felt like a more real experience. You didn't have the crowd getting in the way, the chants, no distractions. And I just felt like every time you heard a big shot connect, it was good to hear. But eventually, it just gets boring. And nowadays, whenever they go to the Apex, it's just a big kind of robbery of what could have happened, because there's no atmosphere there. It's just all you can hear is the coaching, the commentators, and a leg kick getting landed. So I feel like they could have had so many different opportunities if they did go to an actual event. Like, imagine early this year, UFC Shamil Gazir versus Rosenstruck, that fight night was in front of a crowd, or Burns versus Brady later this year were in front of a crowd. It would have been much better. So I feel like the Apex is definitely on its way out. It was fun at the beginning, and it's not as bad as a Brazilian crowd or Salt Lake City, but it's not ideal. So for the Apex, I'm going to put it in C tier. They did say they're going to try and expand the Apex. Apparently, they've put $25 million into expanding the Apex. So I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out. But if you are going to do it in like at least do it in like a small venue with like 1,000 people there, I'd prefer that, so you could still kind of hear the shots rather than just having no crowd at all. So for the Apex, it's going in C tier. Definitely never a good fight night when it's in front of the Apex, but it was fun at the beginning, to be fair. Then we've got Abu Dhabi. Obviously UFC Abu Dhabi just happened. The Abu Dhabi crowd, I'm going to put them in C tier. Listen, they're not as bad as Brazil, and I don't think it's as bad as Salt Lake City, but I feel like first of all, Abu Dhabi is usually cursed, whether it be a complete robbery on an Abu Dhabi card, and I'm also going to use Saudi Arabia as an example of this, whether it be a massive robbery or something going on, like I remember Ankalaev versus Walker went into a no contest here, a massive robbery, fights getting cancelled. It just seems like every time the UFC go to Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia, something cursed happens. In terms of the crowd, they're not a terrible crowd, they're not as bad as Brazil, they're just a bit boring. You could have an amazing fight, and I remember in Saudi Arabia, it was Jared Gordon versus Nasrat Haqparast. Great fight. The crowd were booing it sometimes as well. When it comes to their home fighters, they don't overly cheer for them. They might cheer during the walkout, and that's about it. Whenever there's a banging fight on, they're silent. There's not really any energy. It just feels like when there's a crowd in Abu Dhabi, it doesn't feel like a crowd full of sports fans. It feels like a crowd full of business investors. I don't know. There's something off about the Abu Dhabi places. Me personally, I'm kind of biased because it is in local time in the UK, so I don't have to stay up until 6 AM to watch the Abu Dhabi cards, but they're not bad. They go, you know, the pay-per-views tend to be quite stacked as well, and so do the fight nights in Abu Dhabi, but I just feel like there's not as much atmosphere as there would in like an American crowd or a European crowd, and they just kind of lack in some places. It tends to be cursed. The crowd are a bit boring, so I'm going to put Abu Dhabi in C tier. Boring, nothing overly bad about the cards. It's just usually a bit boring. And finally, we've got Canada. I'm going to put them in C tier as well. Now, Canada themselves aren't that bad. They're just a normal crowd like USA. There's nothing I can really talk about when it comes to the crowd. But the reason I'm not putting it on the same level as USA is because for some reason, the UFC must have something against Canada. Every time they go to Canada, they produce single-handedly the most shit card of all time. Last time they went to Canada, the co-main event was Pennington and Mayra Bueno Silva, and the card was absolutely horrendous. Before that, the main event was Amanda Nunes versus Aldana. I don't understand what the UFC have against Canada, and I really feel bad for the Canadians because the cards are absolute dog shit there, and that's definitely going to have to drag it down a bit. So Canada's going in C tier. The crowd itself, nothing I can say bad against it, and to be fair, the couple of fights that we have had in Canada, like the Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush and Strickland versus Dricus, have delivered, so there's nothing cursed about it, but for some reason the cards, every time they go to Canada, are absolutely horrible, so I'm going to have to put Canada in C tier. But that is my tier list on the venues in the UFC, the ones that they go to on a regular basis, the main venues in the UFC. That is my tier list. Let me know if you'd have switched anything around or if I missed any significant venues out, but thank you for watching.